Hey there, media consumers, savvy and otherwise. Trace here, and I've been thinking about Netflix. A $15 a month excuse to decline all of your social activity invites. Last week, the production and internet video company removed a controversial scene about suicide from their hit show 13 Reasons Why. You might remember 13 Reasons Why from 2016 when it premiered to a lot of fanfare and press. Just a note, this story might trigger some of you who are sensitive to discussions of suicide and self-harm. Just a warning before we dig in too far here. In the show 13 Reasons Why, there is a suicide at the end of season 1 of one of the main characters. It's nearly 3 minutes long. And this week, Netflix, 2 years after it first aired the show, removed this 3-minute graphic scene from that final episode. The scene was controversial as many thought it didn't discourage suicide at all, but glorified it. Suicide is an important topic to cover in a creative work aimed at teens and young adults, if only to be able to point human beings to resources that can help, and to show the brutal reality of isolation and struggle, mental health that goes along with it. To pretend suicide doesn't exist, that's folly, but to glorify it, it's pretty dangerous. Suicide is what's called a contagious behavior. Contagious because it spreads and spreads and can influence others to do it. That's right, one suicide can influence others to commit suicide. It's contagious. I know it sounds far out, but it's not. It's been studied for decades, and we'll get there. When this show premiered, I remember it was all anyone was talking about at work. But did this show glorify or condemn suicide? The showrunner said in a statement, "Our creative intent in portraying the ugly, painful reality of suicide in such graphic detail in season 1 was to tell the truth about the horror of such an act and to make sure no one would ever wish to emulate it." Which is admirable, except a study says people did emulate it, specifically young men. And 2 months after that study was released is now, when Netflix removed the scene. I have some questions about this, and I feel strongly about them, so let's kick into it. Thanks again for tuning in to Uno Dos of Trace. So according to its IMDb synopsis, 13 Reasons Why follows teenager Clay Jensen in his quest to uncover the story behind his classmate and crush Hannah and her decision to end her life. Another way to put it is a love interest of a young male protagonist commits suicide. She gives him a gift, explaining why she did it in a series of cassette tapes. The story then follows Clay trying to see the world from Hannah's perspective. It's based on a book for teens by Jay Asher. We're almost 3 minutes into this video. Can you imagine watching a girl commit suicide on screen graphically for as long as you've been watching this? I think we can all understand the concept of a contagion. Contagions are diseases that spread by infection from one person to another. And most people think of viruses or bacteria or other pathogens, but behaviors, they can be contagious too. And I think you probably already know this, because for example, yawning is contagious, right? Sometimes even just seeing the word yawn can make us do it. That's a contagious behavior, it's easy to see. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that other behaviors that are more complex can also be contagious, like for example, risk and mirth. A small study determined that we will risk more money when we watch other people risk their money. We will be more cautious if we are alone. A 2006 study determined seeing other people laugh causes the brain to tell our facial muscles to smile. And a 2013 study found that clapping might even be contagious. In March of 1983, the New York Times reported something a little more serious, that Micronesia, a country comprised of 607 tiny islands in the Pacific, 3/4 of the way to Indonesia from Hawaii, was seeing a spike in suicide of 15 to 30-year-old men. The rate was twice that of the United States. About 27 people per 100,000. It was, quote, so prevalent that suicide has become an accepted method of problem solving there. It was the #1 cause of death on the Tuck Islands, and one study found it peaked at 110 people per 100,000. 1 in every 909 people was committing suicide. The ratio of males to females committing suicide got as high as 16 to 1. And deaths were clustered, with one young man committing suicide closely followed by several others, like copycats, the Times wrote. On Tuck, the young men would use the word amwunamwun to describe their reaction to expressions of anger or shame. Instead of lashing out or listening to Korn like we did in Michigan, they would refuse food or commit to silence. It was like a self-punishment to vent their feelings. And the thought was, suicide was an extreme form of amwunamwun. By committing suicide, the young men of Micronesia had the ultimate showing of their anger, sadness, or shame. And in a systematic review, they found that less than 40% of these young people had a mental disorder. This behavior was spreading, it was contagious, and it was a huge deal. To summarize, the young men were committing suicide to show just how much they cared to atone for their wrongs, and far more than half were completely neurotypical. You could say they were normal young men. In a review of 16 separate studies looking at the contagious behavior of suicide, the researchers found if a teen knew of someone who had committed suicide, the chances of subsequent suicide attempts increased. The answers to why the behavior is contagious are just way too complex to break down in any one study, but researchers can form correlations and draw conclusions from things like this. So, for example, a March 2019 paper interviewed 118 students in a small town, and they found, quote, "Sudden shocking suicide deaths of high-status youth made it easier for others to grasp suicide as an option. Communities today place a lot of pressure on teens to do everything perfectly. So when one student committed suicide, it sort of opened up the option for others. Almost like an escapist American one-on-one. And social media has only exacerbated this issue, expanding the reach of these influences. Instagram, Tumblr, and other sites provide forums for discussion and glorification of suicide. The power of the digital influencer is so pervasive in our society today, I probably shouldn't have to state it here, but a study did. Of the discussion of public suicide on Instagram, they found public health professionals were, quote, absent and should consider increased involvement. And you don't have to know the person in order for the suicide to matter in your life. Examples abound in 1975, 81, 85, 86, 87, 88, and 99, because there were case studies on specific media that glorified suicide, and it correlated with a subsequent increase in suicide that often used the same method seen in the broadcasts. Fictional displays of suicide also correlate with increased suicide. See, the media is oddly instructional, and is the same one-on-one that some young people are looking for. I've both heard and read that 13 Reasons Why is well made, the music and production are all of top quality, and the show is actually really good. But it always seemed to me that it glorified the main character's suicide. Literally, the entire first season is a narrative explaining why she took her life. You can call it artful, impactful, you can call it important to discuss, and I'm not going to argue with you on any of those counts. But suicide is so tough to talk about in art without making it look kind of appealing. As film and television have moved away from attempting to capture reality and go all in on hyper-reality with green screens and fake characters that aren't even there, we're seeing more of these beautiful depictions of terrible things. So let's put it in perspective from a completely different franchise and storytelling system, Marvel's Infinity War and Endgame. They experienced a universe-wide apocalypse. Yet it was shot to look beautiful, with vines crawling over houses and streets with abandoned cars artfully placed. There was just enough decay to make it look aesthetically pleasing and not so much to make it look actually dismal. They even have picturesque monuments to the lost. But if this was reality, I mean, it didn't carry the emotional weight of half of everyone being dead in an apocalypse, and instead felt like a fascinating, post-apocalyptic, intriguing, familiar thought experiment. Hollywood is incredible at making terrible things look good for storytelling purposes, like entire cities being destroyed, mass murders, or getting punched in the face a lot. None of these things are good, but on TV and film, they look great, even if they're trying to make it seem bad. Hollywood is not equipped to be as sensitive as a public health professional would be when discussing the tragedy of suicide. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm faulting production companies, broadcasters, social media platforms, or even the author of the original book for their roles in bringing suicide to the forefront of a pop culture discussion. It's extremely important to have frank conversations about something that affects so many people, some horribly, some personally, and some chronically throughout their lives. What I do think is interesting is that it took 3 years to remove this scene. Suicide is a contagious behavior. Contagious because it spreads and spreads and influences others, especially when it's glorified. Dr. Rebecca Hendrick, a psychiatrist at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, was an advisor on 13 Reasons Why, and she cited her own anecdotal experience that the show has encouraged many young people to talk to their parents about suicide. She says teens felt seen and heard by 13 Reasons Why. They felt it was a good depiction of what they were going through, which is super important, and I don't want to minimize that at all. I'm not a teen. I don't understand all of the things that they're going through. But what I do know is contagious behavior is real and serious. Contagious behavior doesn't cause suicides, but glorifying suicide can be a risk factor for more suicide. Like smoking is for cancer. When a regional tabloid in Austria reported heavily on suicide by firearm, it correlated strongly with an increase in firearm suicides in their publication area. But also in Austria, the city of Vienna was experiencing a lot of attempted suicide by subway, so they made some changes in how they talked about it. They decreased their attempts 75% simply by creating media guidelines for reporting on suicides, quote, rarely and quote, never in a sensational manner. We have those guidelines in the United States too. The CDC says any media talking about suicide should be factual, concise, and avoid overly simplistic explanations for suicides. They say we should avoid how-to coverage and not cover suicide repetitively or excessively. They also advise broadcasts focus on positive characteristics of the person who committed suicide and to avoid working through all the negatives, which is pretty awkward when you think of 13 Reasons. CDC data was used to estimate that Robin Williams' 2014 suicide correlated with a subsequent 10% increase in suicides nationwide. Do you remember how much coverage that got? It's too soon to know if the 2018 deaths of Anthony Bourdain or Kate Spade correlated with increases. But anecdotally, I don't remember their coverage being very negative. It was more positive about their lives, successes, and positive influences. In 13 Reasons Why, suicide wasn't just graphically portrayed. Like the book, it was the central focus of the narrative. Everyone was talking about the character who committed suicide all the time, and each episode focused on negative things that drove her to a beautiful and horrible 3-minute scene at the end, where she committed suicide. In a 2017 study, they claimed that 13 Reasons Why influenced contagious suicide behavior. But if you take the causation out of it, the number of suicides in young men did rise much higher than usual, so there might be a correlation. We can't really say. This latest 2019 study, the one that came out 2 months before the scene was edited, was titled Investigating Harmful and Helpful Effects of Watching Season 2 of 13 Reasons Why. It seems those who didn't finish watching the second season had greater risks of suicide and less optimism about the future, while those who did finish the second season reported declines in suicide ideation and self-harm by comparison. And in fact, those who watched the entirety of the second season were also more open to helping someone going through a suicidal event compared to those who did not finish the second season. In the end, there's not a good causal relationship between any media and any contagious suicide behavior. There's no causal relationship at all, but there are correlations everywhere. They can either be positive or negative. It may have taken a while, but eventually Netflix chose to remove this section of their program because it was controversial. There's also ample social science that supports this removal might influence fewer people to think about suicide thanks to contagious behavior. Maybe. What do you think? Should Netflix have removed the scene? Should it still be in the show? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you're looking for ways to make positive habits and impacts in your life that stick, check out Skillshare. They help support this episode, in part. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators with more than 25,000 classes in design, business, technology, photography, neuroscience, marketing, or film and video. Whether you want to fuel your curiosity, creativity, or just learn new skills to advance your career, Skillshare is the perfect place to keep you learning and thriving in 2019. Because you're here on Una Dose of Trace, you can get 2 months of Skillshare for free, and after that, it's still really affordable. An annual subscription is only $10 a month. Katrinelle Gerbovan teaches a great class on habit formation where she breaks them into little parts so it's easier to do. She's got a PhD in experimental psychology. People love her class because the little positive habits can change your whole life over time. The first 500 of you to use the magic link here on the screen and in the description to join the more than 7 million people learning with Skillshare are going to get 2 free months. Plus, you support the channel if you do it. So try it out, and thanks. I know this was a really big episode, and I hope you learned something about contagious behavior. I know that I did. I've put some links down in the description for resources on all of this stuff, and if you're thinking about suicide, please reach out to someone. You're loved, you're important, and there are people out there who can help. Thanks for watching. I'm Trace, and I'll see you in the future.